Well, I think what Russia did with Crimea in March 2014 made perfect sense from Russia's point of view, because what the Russians thought, believed, and I think they were right, is now that this coup has occurred, NATO's going to grab Crimea. And Crimea is the home of Russia's naval base. And it has been the home of Russia's naval base since 1783. And Russia saw this as a game going on, and it was a game. The United States participated in this coup, and the idea, in my opinion, but based on my observations, they were replaying the Crimean War scenario. Palmerston, who led the British in the attack on Russia in 1853 in the Crimean War, had the idea of pushing Russia out of the Black Sea. This was Brzezinski's idea, laid out in the Grand Chessboard in his book 1997. The Russians saw, oh my God, the Americans have just done another coup. Not the first time, there have been dozens of these operations. And we're not suckers, so we're taking back, we are taking back Crimea. That part, I think, is
So
indisputable.
the
Okay,
Western reaction to the takeover of Crimea in 2014 was pretty, well, not too strong, I would say. It was
I
pretty
agree.
mild comparatively. And a lot of people argue that that mild reaction encouraged Putin then to fully invade Ukraine in February 2022.
No, this I disagree with.
Yeah,
And,
be
and,
that
and
as it may, does it, what about the justification for the full-scale invasion of Ukraine? Despite all his grievances, despite what it looked like from the Russian point of view, of course, one has to see that, but does it really justify a major war in Europe and trying to shift borders by force and violence and to attack civilians? You know, all the
yeah,
terrible battlefield scenes we can still witness every day.
it's a little more complicated even than this because of the following. In 2002, the United States unilaterally abandoned the anti-ballistic missile treaty. This was probably the single most destabilizing event in the 21st century for US-Russia relations. Russia thought, okay, the United States is abandoning the core principle of how we maintain deterrence. And was done unilaterally. In 2010, the United States started to put in, against heated Russian objections, anti-ballistic missile silos, the Aegis missile systems, first in Poland and then in Romania. In 2019, the United States unilaterally abandoned the Intermediate Nuclear Force Agreement. So from Russia's point of view, what the United States was doing step by step was coming to Russia's border with the US military and its missile systems. According to Ray McGovern, the former CIA analyst, he describes how in January 2022, Blinken, Secretary of State, said to the Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, that the United States reserved the right to put in missile systems wherever it wanted, as long as the host country agreed, including Ukraine. I wasn't party to that conversation, obviously, but the interpretation is consistent with everything I know, because I did speak to the White House in December 2021, begged them to negotiate rather than to continue what was a sure path to war. I said in December 2021 to Jake Sullivan, announce that NATO will not enlarge to Ukraine and you can avoid the war. And he said to me, no, we will not announce that Ukraine cannot enter NATO. He actually said to me, don't worry, NATO's not expanding. I said, Jake, NATO's not expanding, but you can't say it in public? He said, yes. I said, well, then you're going to have a war. And in January 2022, when the United States refused to rule out even putting missile systems into Ukraine, and when there was a continued massive military buildup of the Ukrainian army, and this we really need to understand as well, because it became a several 100,000 NATO armed unit that was attacking the Donbass, as everybody, including the OSCE observers, say. Russia said, we're not going to permit de facto or to slide into being surrounded by the United States.
But
So,
don't you make
okay,
it?
so I'm gonna answer your question the following way. The war could have been avoided so many times had the United States taken an honest position. And then something that I do think is absolutely important and also not part of our understanding and discourse. What was Russia trying to do when it invaded on February 24th, 2022? I'll give you my interpretation. They were trying to scare the wits out of Zelensky that he would agree to neutrality. Because what happened, in fact, was within about a week of the invasion, Zelensky said, oh, you know what? We don't have to join NATO. We could have neutrality. And within 2 weeks, actually, the Ukrainians approached the Russians and said, you know, we don't have to go on with this. And the Russians said to the Ukrainians, give us a document of what you have in mind. And they did. And that document went to President Putin. And President Putin said, you know what? We can negotiate on this basis. And what came immediately was negotiations under the auspices of Turkey. And this became known as the Istanbul process. I have had extensive discussions with the Turkish diplomats about this. So on March 28, Ukraine and Russia issued a joint communique. This is March 28, 2022, issued a joint communique saying we have a framework for peace. And it was based on Ukrainian neutrality. It was based on Crimea being outside of the agreement. In other words, Russia's not going to negotiate that. And it was based on essentially implementing the Minsk II agreement in the Donbass.
But doesn't that all sound as if you were defending Putin for invading or making us understand that
yes, I'm explaining.
No other option but to invade.
No. What I'm explaining is that this war could have ended in about the war starts in 2014 by my chronology, but the invasion, February 24th, could have ended in 2 weeks because it was a ploy to force the neutrality back onto the agenda, which Putin had tried to do in December 2021.
What about the long rows of tanks which were heading towards Kyiv, trying obviously to topple the government in Kyiv?
No, I wouldn't say that. What they were trying to do was intimidate the government, and they were withdrawn as soon as that document was exchanged. That's what actually happened. They were trying to intimidate Zelensky. And you know, this is really important from my point of view. I said to Sullivan in December 2021, Ukrainian neutrality is not a concession. It's a benefit for everybody. It's a benefit for Ukraine. It's a benefit for the United States. It's a benefit for Russia. Keep a buffer between the two superpowers. Don't press your luck, Jake. Said, no, anyway, NATO's not expanding. But he wouldn't say it in public because they didn't mean it. Of course, they wanted to do what they wanted to do because they were playing poker. And to my mind, just to explain, on April 15, 2022, this is basically 8 weeks after the start of Russia's invasion, an agreement was reached with a few clauses still to be finalized. And you can find that online. The New York Times published the agreement. They were close to ending the war. Now, we know that the United States stepped in at that moment and said, don't do it, told the Ukrainians, keep fighting.
Boris Johnson.
Boris Johnson came physically around that time, but you know, the British are not independent agents in this. This was a US policy that this war should continue. And why? Again, I know why. I happen to see some of it. The US deeply believed that they were about to crush the Russian economy, that cutting Russia out of SWIFT was going to bring the Russian economy to its knees. They really believed that. I talked to a lot of senior US officials at the time. I never believed it. I had never seen sanctions actually lead to a fundamental political change in the sanctioned country. It usually is a reason for those governments to toughen up. So in any event, they believed that Russia was not going to survive any of this. So they made the gamble, and the Ukrainians bought into it. We don't have to agree to this treaty. Incidentally, Naftali Bennett, who was the prime minister of Israel, was informally acting as a mediator alongside Turkey. And Bennett gave a remarkably open and kind of discursive interview a couple of years ago where he said, yeah, this agreement was close, but the United States stepped in and said no. And then Bennett said they did it because they thought they would look weak to China. So that this became something about sending signals, looking tough, and so forth. And
a lot of people would say you have a very benign interpretation of Putin's motives and what he was after.
I do.
Yeah.
Because, you know why? Because all during this 30 years, the United States had the upper hand. And the United States used the upper hand in a very arrogant way. It launched wars in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya. It made coups. It abandoned the nuclear arms framework unilaterally. So I put most of the onus on the United States.
But not all of it. So,
well, not all of it, but I put most of it on the United States. No one's perfect.
Would you say that Putin's invasion was totally unjustified and created a lot of misery and death, which was not necessary at all, and was really that he needs to be blamed for that? That to provoke a major land war in Europe after all what happened before, after the two world wars we had in Europe, was, you know, basically very despicable, cannot really be excused in any way.
No, I wouldn't put it that way for reasons that I've explained. The intention was not a major war. The intention was to get to the negotiating table, and it succeeded. And the United States similarly was quite despicable in overthrowing a government or participating in the overthrow of a government. It was quite despicable in launching a CIA operation to overthrow Syria. It was quite despicable in bringing NATO in to overthrow Gaddafi.
We don't want to balance now who is more despicable and
no. But my point is, you know, in general in life, the more powerful country calls the shots. The United States believed that it was the sole superpower. Biden absolutely to the end believed that. He cited this repeatedly. It's not surprising that the powerful country makes most of the abuses, frankly. That's arrogance. That's the arrogance of power.
Let us jump forward a little bit towards the present and
yes.
the still continuing Ukraine war. and the attempt to overcome it and end it, to at least get a ceasefire. And all parties apparently seem to be interested in that, though, of course, there is a lot of suspicion in Western circles whether or not Putin is serious or whether he just says so without really meaning it, because he is militarily at the moment probably a little bit more successful than the Ukrainians. How do you envisage that the war can be overcome? And should Ukraine really be the loser, losing territory, having to give up its natural resources to the United States to a large extent, while Russia probably will be unsanctioned? Would that all be the right way forward to you, according to you?
I think there are three issues right now. It's the same three issues that were on the table in 2022. It's the same three issues essentially that have been on the table with the Minsk agreements as well. One is the question of Ukraine's military alliance or not. I have always believed that the only solution to this war is Ukraine's neutrality. I've always believed Russia will never allow NATO on its border, and that this should have been recognized in the 1990s. We should have
But
fulfilled.
NATO is already on the border of Russia in terms of the Baltic states.
Right, but this is a 2,200-kilometer border, including, crucially, Russia's Black Sea Fleet. And so this is hypersensitive for Russia. And this is what Brzezinski knew all along, and it's what Lord Palmerston knew all along. So the first point I'm saying is Russia will never allow Ukraine to be part of NATO. So either we have perpetual war or the defeat of Ukraine or an agreement on neutrality. I overwhelmingly favor an agreement on neutrality. The second issue is security. There needs to be security guarantees for Ukraine without question. But at the same time, it is absolutely also true there needs to be security for Russia. There needs to be collective security. For Russia, this means they don't want the CIA or the military or the missile systems on their border. And so that's the Russian point of view. The Ukrainians, we don't want to get swallowed by Russia. So there needs to be a security agreement. I think everyone agrees with that. The one point I personally would make is that it should be an agreement in the UN Security Council. This is the right place for it. Other countries, Germany or Turkey or India and others, can join along with that, but this should be a UN Security Council security arrangement. So this is the second point. The third point is territory. And this is vexing, but it's part of the tragedy of this whole story. First, Crimea is never going back, and nor should it in one sense. The US played its hand. It blew it. It should never have done what it did, engaging in regime change. And Crimea, because of its fundamental national security importance for Russia, is not going back. Then comes the question of the 4 territories claimed by Russia. And here, this is painful. It's painful because Russia made no territorial claims on the Donbass, and certainly not on Kherson or Zaporizhia, until the fall of 2022. Never in 2014, never all the way through the Minsk agreements, not in the Istanbul negotiations.
We did not annex these territories, partially 4 of them, before the war actually started.
No, what had happened was these were the people's republics. They had broken away, and the idea that Russia was pursuing was autonomy for these regions. And that's the Minsk II agreement. And it's fascinating what the Minsk II agreement reflects. And I only understood this properly last year when I visited Bolzano in northern Italy, which is a region called South Tyrol, which is a German-speaking region of northern Italy. And it is an autonomous region in Italy, meaning that the central government of Italy does not control the governance of Bolzano. Bolzano does not pay the national taxes. It pays a kind of lump sum that's part of an autonomy agreement. And it came about because there was a German-speaking minority, an Austrian minority, that felt that it was facing discrimination by the Italians after World War II. It has a complex history, but finally it was agreed that it would be autonomous. Now, who knew about that model very well was Chancellor Merkel. She knew about it because she was very friendly with the politicians in South Tyrol, not surprisingly, given that it's a German-speaking population. And the governor, senior officials explained to me in detail last year that for Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, the Minsk II agreement was modeled on the South Tyrol autonomy because Russia was not claiming territorial annexation. That only came in September 2022. It was not on the table beforehand. What was on the table was autonomy. And actually, Germany and France, under something called the Normandy arrangements, were supposed to be the guarantors of Minsk II, which was voted unanimously by the UN Security Council. And the United States and the Ukrainians decided to blow off Minsk II because Minsk II called for Ukraine to make a constitutional provision for autonomy of these two oblasts, Donetsk and Lugansk. And the Ukrainians didn't want to do it. And so they never did it. It was never implemented.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How likely is it that these 3 points which you just outlined, which are, according to you, the best way forward, that will actually be done?
So there's 2 paths right now, and I believe Trump had his word on this one, which I don't often do. But Trump says, look, either you accept the agreement that I'm putting on the table, or the US walks away from this whole thing. The Europeans can do whatever they want, but Russia can continue to fight, Europe can continue to support Ukraine, but the United States is not going to be a part of this. And what the US has said, apparently, we haven't seen the fine print, but it has said basically no NATO, some kind of security arrangement, though I don't know the details of it, and some territorial exchange, maybe up to the current contact line rather than the 4 full oblasts that Russia claims. We don't know exactly the details. Now, in essence, the US is close, not far from the Russian position. Russia's saying, no, we need permanent neutrality, we need all 4 oblasts, and we need a security arrangement in which there aren't European troops, but are some other security arrangement.
Would that not leave Ukraine in a very weakened status?
Well, it depends. It depends what the details are. My view, my model actually for Europe in general is Austrian neutrality in 1955, where the Soviets went home. Austria declared neutrality. We won't join NATO. We won't join anything. And the Soviet Union never bothered them again. Austria became an incredibly prosperous, happy country, and to this day remains outside of NATO. I happen to like neutrality. I especially like neutrality that keeps the United States and Russia apart from each other, because I don't think superpowers should be in each other's backyards, period.